You set up my talk very nicely. Excellent. Okay, well, thank you for inviting me. So I've been spending the last couple of years doing some thinking about political parties and micro-targeting. And today I want to talk about two things. So the first relates to the nature of change we're seeing and that's being caused by digital technology. And the second is some speculative ideas I want to throw out about the implications of these changes for democracy. So just to kind of make sure we're all talking about the same thing, micro-targeting is a very familiar concept, something that's relatively widely talked about. It's not just a political process, it's common within the commercial world, and it's essentially where we see individual level data used to inform strategic decisions about what to target someone with. So in the political context, it's basically why a pensioner won't see the same material as a young voter. We kind of assume that they've got different interests, and so we target specific messages at those individuals. So it's basically moving beyond that generalised message. So in taking that definition, the first question I want to ask is kind of how has digital changed micro-targeting? And I think the most important thing I want to start with is there are many ways in which there has not been a radical change. So micro-targeting and the use of data is a very well-established, very long-established principle of campaigning. And this point has been often made, but it's often overlooked by a rush to see this as something new, and it's really not. Political parties and many other organisations have long harvested our data, and they use it to analyse voter preferences and to conduct targeted campaigns. And actually, political parties are actually given data, they are given access to the electoral roll, they are given access to the marked register, which tells them who votes. And using that data, they construct and have long constructed targeted campaigns using targeted mail. So, you'll have get out the vote operations where political parties will go and knock on doors for months in advance of election to find out who supports their political party, and then they will only target those voters to try and get them to vote. So basically, the idea that prior to digital all voters got the same message just isn't true. Targeting and micro-targeting is an established feature of democracy. But what is new is the way that digital is facilitating that form of campaigning, and it is making it much easier. So I think there's two things to note. So the first is that digital platforms such as Facebook and Google gather and they sell access to data. And that provides a new data resource that enables micro-targeting. So in countries like the UK, it isn't possible to buy things like magazine subscriptions and you feed them into voter databases like it is in the US. Parties have to rely on largely public information or data that they collect themselves in order to be able to conduct micro-targeting. But with the advent of things like Facebook, this new data, it's often highly personalised, is available and can offer new insights that enables micro-targeting. And this change is wildly significant because it hugely lowers the barrier of access to be able to do micro-targeting. And this means that new people can have access to that data for electoral purposes that they previously wouldn't have been able to have. But it also it lowers the barrier in terms of previously getting that data was quite a high, it's a very work-intensive exercise. You would actually have to go and knock doors. It required a lot of activists. Whereas now that data is freely available because we're giving it away ourselves, often unknowingly. The second thing is that these platforms, like Facebook, Google, they don't just provide data, they also provide tools and services that are very easy to use and allow political parties and other actors to connect with voters in a different and new way. So the Facebook advertising tool is very easy to use. It allows whoever is placing an advert to select a whole range of different categories and to swiftly develop a very highly targeted message if you so desire. It can be designed and launched in very short periods of time, and basically anyone can do it. It's no longer the case that we have political party elites who are designing these messages and pushing them out through their organisational hierarchies. Basically, any kid with a laptop, and I've interviewed many of these kids, can sit down and design an advert that goes out very, very widely with with no sign-off from any organisation. So, essentially, micro-targeting is now very easy to do and can be done with minimal expertise or institutional authority, which is something I'm interested in. You just need a credit card and you need to be resident in the place that you're trying to commission an advert if you want to do it on Facebook. So micro-targeting is not new. but it does seem to be different in the digital realm. And this brings me to the second question, which is something I'm starting to think about, which is, so what are the implications of this for democracy? So in my area of research, everyone is basically screaming about the democratic problems of micro-targeting. And there's been a real rush to say we need to do something, we need to crack down on micro-targeting. In Spain, for example, they've just banned micro-targeting at the election. And I think this is really important. It does feel like there's something going on here, but I think we actually really need to think about, well, why is it problematic, and what is digital about that problem? And so I think it's important to kind of think about established democratic principles and then work out, well, how are those principles being violated by digital micro-targeting as opposed to just targeting in general? So I've got I'm going to float some principles and then think through how they might be affected by digital. So the first one is this idea of common debate that we've already heard talked about. And I think this is quite essential to many conceptions of democracy, this idea that there should be a shared public discourse and common debate. And it is an idea that is challenged by micro-targeting because rather than sharing a common message and information, voters can receive very, very different information and visions, as you were talking about. So it's important. But actually, that's a principle that's violated by micro-targeting, whether it's online or offline. There isn't actually something specifically about digital that's challenging that idea. And I think, the only way in which digital is potentially different there is because it's making it easier to do that messaging. But I think we need to kind of be clear about the fact that you can't just look at this as a digital problem. That's a wider thing that we need to talk about that isn't just about digital. So a second area where I think digital does raise more questions is around transparency. So the idea that citizens should be able to find out information and hold campaigners to account is a very key component of the idea of free and fair elections. But at the moment, it's very, very challenging to identify the kind of micro-targeting campaigns that are going on. Again, not just a digital problem. Like, transparency issues have always been there. But we have existing regulations to oversee non-digital campaigns, and we don't have them for digital. And this is a real issue because digital technology, as I've discovered to my cost over the last few years, is very difficult to study, and it's very, very difficult to study in real time. No one is collecting, for example, micro-targeted adverts. We do have the Facebook archive, but it's incredibly difficult to search and not particularly complete. And this kind of suggests that there is something specific about digital that is having a real implication for transparency. And so it seems to me that there does need to be a response there to that idea. So thirdly, and related to the idea of transparency, accountability. So the idea that citizens should be able to hold their campaigners to account is a key democratic principle. And in the context of micro-targeting, it's notable that few actors have been able to use these tools because it's quite difficult to get access to data. So when parties are kind of given access to the electoral roll, other actors would kind of have to curate themselves that data themselves. But with the advent of digital, this kind of availability of data is much more commonplace, and micro-targeting can now essentially be done by everyone. And that means that new campaigners within and beyond parties now have access to data and can deploy targeted messages. And I think that does have consequences, because whereas we used to have these established institutions that had a reputation to uphold and therefore could be held to account for what they were doing, we now have a whole range of different campaigners who can pop up, do something completely outrageous, and then disappear. And there's no kind of longevity in their status to mean that they can be held to account in the same way. So I think there's something about the availability and the lower barriers to these tools that is also concerning about digital and that needs to be addressed. How much time have I got, Graham?
A couple of minutes.
Okay, good. Okay,
I'll just
4.
say that anyway, randomly.
Okay, well, I've got 5 points, so I'll get through them all. So my fourth one is privacy and consent.
You're just looking at it if there's nothing.
There have been a lot of issues raised about the way in which data is being used, and the idea that some data is made available to campaigns is an established part of democracy. But it's not really clear where the boundaries of what acceptable data is. So recent changes in GDPR suggest that data needs to be consensually gained and used for specific purposes, and that relates to online and offline campaigning. But in the digital realm, the boundaries of informed consent are much more porous, it seems to me. So social media platforms and digital companies have built their business models on data collection, as you were talking about earlier. And people consent to this data use in signing up for services, but do they really know what they're signing up for? I think that there's something very different about telling someone who you're voting for on the doorstep as opposed to, Facebook inferring that you're liberal by your practices online. It feels very different. So that suggests to me, again, that digital data collection and use is different to non-digital data collection. And that therefore we need to really think about the idea of consent and what this means around micro-targeting online. And then my final point is about unfair advantage. So the idea that democracy should be a level playing field and that actors cannot gain an unfair advantage through financial superiority is widely accepted. It's not universal in the US. But in the UK, electoral regulation is designed to ensure financial parity amongst all access, and they use spending limits to govern campaigns. But online, the principles of purchasing are very different. So Facebook advertising that I've looked at, for example, operates on a marketplace principle. And that means that if the Conservative Party spend £100 and Labour spend £100, they can get vastly different things with that money because a very targeted advert in a marginal constituency is going to be much more expensive than a generic message across non-marginal constituencies. So basically, I think that the dynamics of electoral competition and spending are being radically altered online in a way that isn't being responded to in existing regulations. So digital is not only making it easier to campaign, but it has the potential to allow those with resources to dominate the campaign and to get access with the voters who have most influence. So there's a question of unfair advantage as well in digital. So what I want to just wrap up by saying is I think that micro-targeting essentially isn't new. This is my message. I'm going to keep on banging on about it, even though it's often said. And I think that we need to acknowledge that, and we need to think about actually what is a democratic question that is applicable offline as well as online. But I think when we do start actually thinking about what is it that's happening online with micro-targeting, it does raise questions that suggest that there is something specific about digital which is having consequences for our democracy.
Thank you, it's great. Thank you.